Welcome to a Christmas message from your friends at the Festival Center. My name is Bill Mefford. Beginning in February, you can listen to monthly podcasts produced by the Festival Center called The Called Activist, where we will share thoughts on what is happening in the world at the time, and we will also have interviews with activists to find out why they do what they do. I hope you will join us. For now, this is a reflection on Luke 1:46 through 55, Mary's Song of Praise. The year was 1955, a year when so much was happening in the world. In March of that year, Winston Churchill stepped down for the final time as Prime Minister, but not before approving defense spending on a new hydrogen bomb while acknowledging the continued angst and aggression between communist and non communist countries. It was in 1955 that both the United States and the Soviet Union continued testing atom bombs, increasingly making them deadlier and more devastating with each test. Meanwhile, Albert Einstein and 6 other Nobel laureates signed a letter to the U.S. government urging them to find peaceful means to resolve international disputes. They wrote, in view of the fact that any future war, nuclear weapons will certainly be employed, and that such weapons threaten the continued existence of humankind, we urge the governments of the world to realize and acknowledge publicly their purposes cannot be furthered by a world war. It was also in 1955 that South Vietnam was declared a republic under the new leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem, who would later be assassinated with the backing and approval of the United States just a few short weeks before President Kennedy's assassination. While the United States asserted both at home and around the world that their struggle against communism was a struggle for freedom, those claims rang hollow when, preceding 1955, the CIA, under the leadership of conservative Christian John Foster Dulles, with help from the Secretary of State, his brother Alan, launched violent overthrows of democratically elected governments in Iran in 1953 and Guatemala in 1954. These overthrows were powered by the beliefs that communism and Christianity were incompatible, and that Christianity and capitalism are virtually one and the same. This brand of theology, commonly adopted by religious nationalism, asserts that the rights of private U.S. based corporations to engage in extractive business in foreign countries was more important than democratic elections that upheld human rights in those countries. But it wasn't just U.S. foreign policies which were full of empty promises. The United States, since the end of Reconstruction in 1877, had created a two-tiered system of apartheid between blacks and whites. And to maintain the U.S. form of apartheid, those in power would defend it with all of the violence they could muster. And they did. According to the excellent report by the Equal Justice Initiative, most lynchings had all but disappeared by the 1950s. However, 1955 was an especially deadly year, as whites in power renewed their efforts to maintain white power. Here are the names of the people who were lynched because they threatened white control in 1955. May 7th, Reverend George Lee, Belzoni, Mississippi. Reverend Lee headed the local chapter of the NAACP and was the first black person registered to vote in Humphreys County. He was urging others to register as well. August 13th, Lamar Smith, Brookhaven, Mississippi. Mr. Smith was a member of the Regional Council on Negro Leadership and was an activist who was trying to get others to register to vote when he was shot on the courthouse lawn in front of 30 white witnesses, including the sheriff. No one was ever tried for his murder. August 28th, Emmett Till, Muddy, Mississippi. The most famous of those lynched in 1955, Emmett Till was 14 years old when he was brutally murdered for offending a white woman in a store. August 23rd, John Earl Reese, Longview, Texas. Reese was 16 years old and was killed while dancing in a cafe with his friends during a drive-by shooting by white men outraged after the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision and the subsequent request that black people in Longview wanted a new public school. November 5th, Howard Bromley, Heathsville, Virginia. Mr. Bromley, 23 years old at the time of his assassination, was shot by a white store owner for supposedly refusing to leave when he was told to. And December 3rd, Clinton Melton in Glendora, Mississippi. Mr. Melton was 33 years old, a World War II veteran, a father of five, and a gas station attendant. A man came in and became angry with Mr. Melton and eventually shot him after driving home to get his gun. The man who shot Mr. Melton was friends with the men who murdered Emmett Till, and Melton's killer was even driving a car owned by one of Till's killers at the time. And both the murderers of Till and Melton were acquitted in the same courtroom. 1955 was a time of international and regional oppression, murder, and injustice, much like the time when Jesus was born into this world. This is the time we now turn to for our story. As we are nearing the end of Advent, for those of us who follow Jesus, we are eagerly anticipating the birth of a baby in a barn in an obscure small town of Bethlehem who will grow up and ultimately change the world. Thus, it is appropriate that this is the month back in 1955 when the actions of an unknown but revolutionary group of women prepared the way for the birth of the modern day civil rights movement and the emergence of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as the movement's most powerful and eloquent leader. On December 1, 1955, just 2 days before Clinton Melton was shot dead at the place he worked, a woman named Rosa Parks, who worked part-time as a seamstress and also as the secretary of the local office of the NAACP, was arrested for sitting on a bus. Birmingham was segregated, of course, and by refusing to give up her seat to a white man, she broke the law. While this action has been thought by many folks throughout history to have been a spur-of-the-moment reaction by a woman who was simply tired and not wanting to move, this was actually the work of an activist who had been trained in nonviolent disobedience. In June of that same year, 1955, or just weeks after Reverend George Lee was lynched for being the sole black person registered to vote in Belzoni, Mississippi, Rosa Parks attended a week of training on nonviolence at Highlander Folk School led by Miles Horton. Miss Parks was recommended to attend the training from a white woman who had hired her as a part-time seamstress named Virginia Durr. Virginia Durr and her husband, a lawyer named Clifford, had been active in Democratic politics, and because of their progressivism and their views advancing integration, they were targets of Mississippi Senator James Eastland, who was holding hearings throughout the South and who could not fathom how a white Southerner would support black equality. Thus, he held the hearings to root out this venal form of liberalism, what he called communism, from U.S. society. Two of the people he went after in his hearings were Virginia Durr and her husband, Clifford Durr. The following you will hear is a clip of a documentary from Alabama Public Television about the Durrs. You will hear a number of historians and then briefly the voices of Clifford and Virginia Durr themselves.
she decides that she will answer the question about membership in the Communist Party because she is concerned about Hugo. And she'll say no, but then answer no other questions. Because she had utter contempt for Eastland. So she propped herself up in the chair before him, said she stood in utter contempt of the committee, would answer no further questions, and then pulled out her compact and started to powder her nose.
During the hearings, Eastland called up one of their trusty professional witnesses that they always used, Paul Crouch, and he's a man whose knowledge of communist infiltration was vastly exceeded by his propensity to exaggerate, lie, make up stories. And during his testimony, claims that Virginia is a communist.
For Clifford Durr, hearing that as her husband, it just infuriates him. He goes ballistic, basically. And yeah, he charges up from the audience, lunges over the little barrier in the courtroom, tries to get at Paul Crouch.
He started after him and saying, "You lie about my wife, you son of a bitch, I'll kill you." I believe that was the exact words that he used.
I don't remember what I said. I just have to rely on the newspapers.
It was on the front page of the New York Times, I can
tell you. But I
remember
the marshals holding me firmly, but sort of gently, as if we don't blame you, guy, but we can have this happening in the federal courtroom.
Cliff has a minor heart attack. It's a pretty dramatic way to end the hearings for the day, I think. To everyone's surprise, it backfires on Eastland. Most of the press, even the Southern press, attacks Eastland. And it has the additional outcome that I don't think she anticipated of liberating her.
Once, Cliff, it was clear that Cliff was going to be okay and he recovered. Virginia said that in a way she felt liberated, by the Eastland hearings, because now it had finally blown her cover as a nice, proper Southern lady, and she could finally say what she really thought.
The liberation Virginia Durr experienced included being shunned by the white community in Montgomery and being embraced by Montgomery's black community. When the Durrs were ostracized, their only public support came from a group of African American women named the Women's Political Council, led by Joanne Robinson. Virginia Durr reached out to Robinson and the other women to thank them for their support, and thus began their friendship. The social and political importance of being liberated from the opinions of the ruling class, as Virginia Durr experienced through being targeted by Senator Eastland's crusade, is best expressed by the African writer Albert Memmi, who wrote in the late 1950s during the African independence movements. In his book, Memmi urges those in positions of power and influence who are penitent to, quote, take one more step and complete their revolt to the full. Adopt the colonized people and be adopted by them. Let them become a turncoat to their former positions of power and affluence. This, in essence, is the difference between liberalism and liberation. While liberals hold views counter to unjust systems, the liberated who were previously detached from those who suffer now become authentically related with those who suffer, while at the same time becoming detached from prior positions of safety and isolation. Liberals condemn injustice. The liberated are kin to those crushed by injustice. The former may remain a benefactor from racism and injustice, though somewhat reluctantly. The latter have so removed themselves from racism and injustice that they now experience at least some of the residual harm. For Virginia Durr, one of the people she found new solidarity with was seamstress and local NAACP secretary Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks worked for the head of Montgomery's NAACP chapter, E.D. Nixon, who was also an organizer for the Sleeping Car Porters. Because Highlander Folk School was an interracial training center to help build movements for leaders from racial, religious, and labor organizations in the South, E.D. Nixon, Virginia Durr, and Rosa Parks all knew one another. Highlander helped weave them together. And this is the power of organizing. It brings us into connections with those who share our passions and want to achieve real change. And this is how movements thrive when organizations connect and work with one another. So in June of 1955, some 6 months prior to Rosa Parks refusing to move from her bus seat, Rosa Parks went to Highlander. It was there that she said, quote, "I found out for the first time in my adult life that this can be a unified society, that there was such a thing as people of differing races and backgrounds meeting together in workshops, living together in peace and harmony. It was a place I was very reluctant to leave. I gained there strength to persevere in my work for freedom, not just for blacks, but for all oppressed people." Her refusal to move from her seat for a white bus rider on December 1st was thus a planned move from someone trained in nonviolent disobedience who simply wanted to have her human rights recognized. Interestingly, according to David Chappell's book, Inside Agitators, another woman on the bus when Rosa Parks was arrested was Bertha Butler. Bertha Butler knew E.D. Nixon, the head of the local chapter of the NAACP, and she herself was part of the Women's Political Council. This was the same group, as we mentioned earlier, led by Joanne Robinson, who sent a supportive letter to activist Virginia Durr, who was being hounded as a communist by Mississippi Senator James Eastland. So Bertha Butler also alerted Joanne Robinson, and the Women's Political Council sprang into action. Listen to Miss Robinson share her story the night before the boycott.
But we had worked for at least 3 years getting that thing organized. The night of the evening that Rosa Parks was arrested, Fred Gray called me and told me she was arrested. Somebody gone her bail, but her case would be on Monday. And I, as president of the main body of the Women's Political Council, got on the phone and I called all the officers of the 3 chapters. I called as many of the men who had supported us as possible. And I told them that Rosa Parks had been arrested and she would be tried. They said, "You have the plans, put them into operation." I called every person who was in every school and every place where we had planned to be at that, have somebody at that school or wherever it was at a certain time, that I would be there with materials for them to disseminate. I didn't go to bed that night. I cut those stencils. I ran off 35,000 copies of the little foyer that you have. And I distributed them. I had classes from 8 to 10 at the college. And at 10 o'clock, I had 2 senior students who had agreed to go with me. I took them in my car. The packages were already there. It would take about a half a minute to drive on the school campus. The kid would be there. In just a minute, they would disappear. The ministers were meeting that afternoon or sometime during the day on High Street. They were having the International Ministerial Association meeting. And after we had circulated those 35,000 circulars, then we went by the church. That was about 3:30 in the afternoon, and we took them to the ministers. And it was there that they learned there was to be a boycott. And they agreed to meet at Dr. King's church, Dexter Avenue, that night to decide what should be done about the boycott after the first day.
Though the Montgomery bus boycott is mostly remembered by the action of Rosa Parks and the leadership of Martin Luther King, there would have been no year-long boycott if there hadn't been the first day of the boycott, which was entirely due to Robinson and the Women's Political Council. Robinson chaired the Women's Political Council and served on Reverend King's Political Affairs Committee at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. As she just shared, she and other members of the Women's Political Council stayed up all night where they worked at Alabama State College, a historically black university. They wrote and rewrote the message that would be distributed all over town the next day. As historian Taylor Branch recounts, their work required stealth. because the college was funded largely by the Alabama legislature. If white people ever learned that state employed teachers had used taxpayer owned facilities to plot a revolt against segregation laws, heads would roll, budgets would surely be cut. So the women resolved to finish the mammoth task before daylight and never to speak of what they had done. Joanne Robinson had been wanting to start the boycott since she herself had experienced her own discrimination at the hands of a white bus driver back in 1950. Also, a year earlier, a young woman named Claudette Colvin had been arrested for refusing to give up her seat for white passengers. Robinson was not supported by other leaders in defending Colvin, so nothing came of it, but with Parks, she mobilized them into action. Amazingly, tens of thousands of African Americans who lived and worked in Montgomery stayed off the buses, and they were mobilized in just 2 days. Upon seeing the success of the one-day boycott, Nixon formed the Montgomery Improvement Association and named the young new pastor at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church as its chair, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The rest, as they say, is history. What I am so thankful for this Christmas is the passion and skill of organizer Joanne Robinson, the networking skills of Virginia Durr, and of course, the bravery of Rosa Parks. I can't help but think that in December of 1955, as this new boycott of buses took off, if Miss Robinson or Miss Durr or Miss Parks thought about the Song of Mary as she sang praise to God for giving her the gift that she would share with the world, the coming of the liberator, Jesus. As Mary sang in Luke 1:45 through 54, my soul magnifies the Lord, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For God has looked with favor on the lowliness of God's servant. Surely from now all generations will call me blessed. For the Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is God's name. God's mercy is for those who show reverence from generation to generation. God has shown great strength and has scattered the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. God has brought down the powerful from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. God has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. God has helped the servant Israel in remembrance of God's mercy, according to the promise God made our ancestors, to Abraham and to God's descendants forever. In a world filled with violence, with murder, and lying politicians seeking to preserve their power and ignoring the needs of the people, God chose Mary and called her blessed. In 1955, in a world filled with violence, much of it perpetuated by the United States, that was bent on privileging business and a nationalist form of violence, in a country where people are controlled by lynchings and systemic racism, covered up by lying politicians interested in preserving their power and exploiting vulnerable people, God chose Rosa Parks, Virginia Durr, Joanne Robinson, and so many others, and called them blessed. And today, in a world filled with violence, much of it perpetuated by the United States and our massive business of trafficking in arms, and in a country where the incoming administration is laser focused on privileging corporations and a nationalist form of Christianity devoid of biblical fidelity, covering it all with politicians and Supreme Court justices who both exploit vulnerable communities and who lie to preserve and expand their own power, God is choosing us. God chooses us so that we might reflect the kingdom dreams God has for the world. God chooses us so that we might follow the example of Joanne Robinson, who risked her livelihood and organized her people to resist injustice. God chooses us we might follow the example of Virginia Durr, who left all of the conveniences and safety of her privileged life so that she might be liberated to authentic relationships with people targeted by unjust powers. God chooses us so that we might follow the example of Rosa Parks, who trained herself through disciplines and practices for peace, so that when the time would come, as it most certainly would, she would be ready. So as we follow the example of people like Mary, Rosa Parks, Virginia Durr, and Joanne Robinson, God will also call us blessed. Merry Christmas.